there was no quit. At times he would have to pull me back and be like, dude, you've got to stop. But that's just a personality trait. If I'm going to do something, I'm very decisive in that way, and that I'm going to follow it to its inevitable conclusion, whether that's an exercise or a life choice or whatever it may be.
That was powerlifter and strongman Rodney Miller, and this is episode 9 of the Bravest Podcast. So what does it truly take to stare a challenge in the face and push on no matter how deep you have to dig? According to today's guest, it's not only about physical strength, although he's arguably one of the strongest guys out there. It's really about purpose, and it's about mindset. Hey everyone, welcome back to the Bravest Podcast. For those of you who might be new to the show, my name is Craig, I'm your host, and the mission of the podcast is to help you take adversity head on to create the healthiest version of yourself possible. Here I focus on sharing remarkable stories of self-care, of mental strength and nutrition, among many other topics. And this is all being offered in the hopes that you'll take a small piece of it to create and sustain healthy change in your own life, so you're ultimately better equipped to make an impact on your world. Now, my guest for today's show is powerlifter and strongman Rodney Miller. Now, Rodney was born to a cattle rancher family in southern Oklahoma, and not too long into his life's journey, he was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes and spent over 2 weeks in a coma as a result of dangerously high blood glucose levels and DKA, or diabetic ketoacidosis. And although Rodney was only 4 years old at the time, he believes his inherent stubbornness was a key factor that really kept him alive. A self-described runt, standing at 4 feet 9 inches tall and weighing in at just about 90 pounds, Rodney was the smallest person in his class all through school. It was only after multiple hospitalizations as a young adult that Rodney started to gain significant weight, but that was only because he burned out and stopped taking care of himself. And during that time, Rodney was less than consistent taking insulin, and his diet was massively out of control. He was on a dangerous roller coaster ride, and it really wasn't until his wife shared the fact that she was pregnant that a switch finally flipped in Rodney's head. And it took the realization that he was soon to be responsible for another life to push him on a course to better health and wellness. Now, Rodney's story is one of inner strength and perseverance, and really about purpose. And what you'll learn in this conversation is that he has an unusual ability to push himself through physical pain and mental pain and discomfort, which he believes stemmed from a single discussion with his father when Rodney was just a young boy. Now, what he's turned himself into physically as a competitor, being someone who lifts truck axles and pulls fire engines and even lifts cars, is nothing short of amazing. I think you're going to learn a lot from this interview and maybe even start to consider your own strengths and how to overcome any real or maybe perceived barriers that life might be presenting to you at this point in time. So here we go, from self-described runt to inspirational strongman. This is my conversation with Rodney Miller. Cool. Hey, Rodney, how are you today?
I'm doing good.
Awesome. Thanks for taking this time to sit down with me. You know, I've been looking at your background as just kind of researching for the show, and dude, you have such an amazing story, and I'm really looking forward to digging into this conversation with you today.
Yeah, I'm really excited to be here. I appreciate you having me on, and anything you want to know, I'm pretty much an open book.
Awesome. So look, I typically will start off the podcast asking the same question of my guests because I kind of feel that it helps me understand who you are as an adult. So I'm curious to understand where you grew up, and more or equally as important, I'm really interested in understanding what kind of a kid you were.
Uh, so I grew up in southern Oklahoma, and we were cattle ranchers as a family. So it was a pretty active life, even though I may not have wanted it to be that way. I was a pretty hardcore video game enthusiast. I had the Nintendo, I had the Atari, the Game Boy, the Game Gear, the Sega. I had them all, and I was very avid. Was also a very avid reader. I don't know if you're familiar with them, but they did these books and they were basically easier to read versions of the classics, like A Tale of Two Cities, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, things like that. And it was called the Great Illustrated Classics. And they were written on about a third to fifth grade level. And I literally read every book. Every book that was in that entire series, I read by the time I was 8 years old.
Wow.
I was a very avid reader. And for me, growing up, I grew up in a very small town. There were only anywhere between 12 to 17 kids in my class from year to year. And I was obviously the only type 1 diabetic. So as a way to manage kind of the loneliness that comes with that, the inherent separation that there would be, is I just dove into games or I dove into books as an escape from that sort of kind of mental burden.
Sure. Do you think you were an introvert by nature, or do you think that I want to talk about your diagnosis story in a second, so let's not dive too much into that just yet, but do you think that you were an introvert by nature, or do you think that was something that kind of evolved as a result of the diabetes?
So actually, I was a pretty typical introvert up until the fifth grade. And then in the fifth grade, I kind of just came to a self-realization one day. I woke up and I said, I don't like who I am. In a class this small, I have very little interaction with anybody else. I have very little interaction with the teacher. And I don't like myself. I don't like where this is going. And so I'm just going to not be that way anymore. And so I flipped the switch, and from pretty much that day forward, I have been about as extroverted as a human being possibly can.
That's pretty amazing for someone that young to have that level of kind of instinct, or to even view yourself from that perspective. Takes, I would guess, a super amount of intelligence to actually be able to do that.
I don't think there's a way for me to answer that without sounding mildly egotistical, but I was blessed with a very very large sense of self-awareness. And you also have to think, as an introvert, you are constantly analyzing all of your actions and the motives behind those actions, or I did. And so I had pretty well mapped myself out to a point, even at that age, because that was the only thing I could do. I didn't have any social interactions. There was no other dialogue going on except within myself. And so I just ran the dialogue, and I tried to determine the motives behind why I was doing things. And I was also a very small child. I was the stereotypical runt. To give you an idea, as a freshman in high school, I was 4'9" and 90 pounds.
Wow.
I was literally the smallest person, not the smallest male, the smallest person in my class.
It's really interesting because when you talk about being an introvert, and I think that goes, and we're going to definitely get into your athletics, and there's a lot about the athletic components, the things that you do from an athletic perspective that is somewhat introverted, really, because your sport, and we're going to talk about this, is very much you're in your head a lot of the times. Mm-hmm. And the ironic thing is that you're telling me that you were the runt of your class, but yet you're participating in these competitions. Again, we're going to talk about that. So, and this will all kind of make sense for the listener as we go through. It just doesn't make too much sense for me, but we'll get into that in a little bit. So you were, from what I understand, you were actually diagnosed at a super early age. You were about 4 years old, correct?
Yes. Yeah, I was 4 years old. It was pretty much your typical very high volume of fluid intake, a lot of urination, a lot of fatigue and irritability. And at 4, it looks like a lot of other things, at that age. And especially because we were living in rural Oklahoma, like there just wasn't a lot of other people to be around. But eventually my parents realized that something was indeed wrong. And so they rushed me to the hospital. And I have a very distinct memory of the doctor coming in and saying, you need to say your goodbyes because he probably will not survive. I was in advanced stages of DKA. I had an 880 blood glucose level. And so it was not looking too good. And I owe it nothing but just stubbornness. If there's one character trait that I've had my entire life, it's that I have an incredible amount of almost stubborn stupidity in that I will hold on. And so I actually went into a coma for 2 weeks and somehow managed to come out of that largely unscathed. I can remember periods of light and background audio noise, but nothing that ever made sense afterwards. So after that was pretty much the start of a very different childhood than I'm sure my parents had envisioned. And they did the best they could, but their mindset was something that at the time was a bit damaging to my psyche, but as later on in life kind of given me a mental fortitude to combat it. And it allows me to speak from a unique perspective to others.
And what's that?
I remember my father, it was one of the times I was having a really hard time dealing with diabetes in general. I think I was probably about 10 or 11 years old, and they were very strict. And so we were using Humulin N and Humulin R. And so as we know, Humulin R has about a 45-minute window until it's active in the system. And so if they checked my blood sugar and I was high, I got a correction shot as well as a bolus for dinner, and then I had to wait the 45 minutes. And it didn't matter if it was Thanksgiving, it was Christmas, it was Halloween, it was a normal Sunday at home. I waited, whether it didn't matter how hungry I was. They thought, and that's what they thought was the best thing to do. But my father sat me down and he said, diabetes is your problem, and no one else will ever care about it. So you need to learn how to deal with this. It's on you, and you have a choice. You can choose to excel, or you can choose to give up. Now, let's reiterate how stubborn I am. And if somebody backs me into a wall and they say, give up or go forward, I went forward. Now, that's not saying that I didn't land myself in and out of the ER several times as a late teenager because I thought that I knew everything, because that's a stage that I feel like most teenagers go through. But that was kind of the mindset that I had for the longest time. And even athletically speaking, when I first started competing in strength sports, no one knew.
Sure.
I didn't share it with teammates. I didn't share, or not teammates, but I didn't share it with fellow competitors. I didn't ever acknowledge that anything that I was doing was in any way special. Because to me, in the mindset that I was raised with, it really wasn't.
Now, where do you think that mindset came in for your dad? Is that something that's kind of typical of small town Oklahoma, or do you think something that's unique to your dad?
It's something very unique to my father. My father is he was a self-made man. They were literally squatters when they were growing up. It means they didn't have a home to live in. So they would, hide out in people's barns or sheds, or, camp out in people's property, out in the countryside. And so he led a very hard life. And that sort of life can harden not only your body, but it hardens your mind, and it hardens your heart to a point that you have to become self-reliant. And so I think I don't hold any animosity for what he said. And like I said, has ended up being of great service to me now that I have a little bit better context to draw from. Because ultimately, at the end of the day, if I don't take the steps I need to take to control my diabetes, you're not going to do it for me. Now, I'm sure you would reach out and help me in any way that you could, that's feasible, but you're not going to give me my shots. You're not going to check my finger. You're not going to prepare my meals. So I learned early on in life, a little harshly, that these were my responsibility and that I had to take ownership of these things if I wanted to succeed in life.
Sure. So what he's really telling you is, and I often ask this question of guests that I'll interview. I'll say, what do you think is more important, intrinsic or extrinsic motivation? And what you're pointing to here is that your dad helped you develop this intrinsic motivation very early on, without realizing that it was motivation per se. But so what I'm hearing from you is that for you, you're very intrinsically motivated. Do you think that one is better than the other, or do you think one is more important than the other?
And my experience comes from the fitness world, and we'll go into that in more detail, I'm sure. But I know in coaching clients, and especially when it comes to nutrition clients, is that if they're not internally motivated, I can only carry them so far.
Sure.
And so while I'll be the first one to tell you that the external motivation is a very powerful tool to prolong somebody's success or to get them over a hurdle, there has to be a certain amount of intrinsic motivation to take the step.
Sure.
Like you can't shove someone down a path. They have to be willing to take the first step. That's a very overused cliche, but I find that it's a very accurate one in that you have to be open to change before you can make a change.
Sure. Makes a lot of sense. I want to back up for just a second, because you talked a little bit about the fact that you had a very small class and very small town, and your parents did the best that they possibly can do. What was the support system like at that point for your family when you were first diagnosed?
We were driving 45 minutes to an hour to see a doctor for about the first 2 years. After that, we went to a local doctor who was an internist. There were no endocrinologists within an hour of us. And they basically said, you know the disease better than we do, you deal with it. They also said things like, don't give him too much insulin because it can damage the body. And so that made the 6-inch growth spurt I experienced in, 8th grade to junior high, from freshman to sophomore years of high school, a very difficult time. I have memories of curled up in a ball in the fetal position in the floor from hunger pains. Because hormones are running everywhere, most of which drive up glucose levels. And so the doctors at that time, unfortunately, were telling us to restrict insulin. And so it made it, and like I said, my parents were very strict with that. If my blood sugars were elevated, I simply wasn't allowed to eat. And so, right or wrong, that's what happened. That's not something I ever wish to happen to anybody else. And so, thankfully, I haven't seen anyone else that I've run across in the online community say that the doctors are still, and it was probably very indicative of small town doctors.
Yeah, I'm sure that look, you're talking a number of years ago now as well, and information is readily available online, at least the very basic information to help people if they have just some initial questions of where to turn to. Look, things like what you're putting out into the world and what we're doing here with the podcast will hopefully help people get information that they might not find elsewhere. So when you were growing up, who was your biggest influence in life?
100% my father. I was never a fan of team sports. Once again, when you're the runt and you're in a small school like that, we only had baseball or basketball. Not going to excel at 4'9". My name's not Spud Webb.
You're not going to be the center for the basketball team.
Exactly. So, I really never looked up to sports figures too much. I never, there wasn't as much open source knowledge as far as like the academic guys out there. There was no Degrassi Tyson out there at that day and time. So it was pretty much my father, and it was, like I said, he was a self-made man. He picked himself up from not having a home when he was a child to owning a very large ranch in southern Oklahoma. So that was pretty much it.
Not a bad person to look up to, who was able to pull themselves completely with nothing and building such a big empire for himself there. So that's great. Yeah. So from what I've read, and please correct me if I'm wrong, growing up, you were overweight at one point, and you had some poor control over your blood sugars for a period of time. As you mentioned a little bit, you alluded to being in and out of the hospital with some complications here and there. So usually there's kind of a breaking point where we say to ourselves, something's just not working. And I'm really curious to understand this transition between, okay, you're not doing well with your health, and then all of a sudden a flip switches in your head, basically, like it did when you said that you were in that classroom that day and you didn't want to be that way anymore. You wanted to be something different. When did you make this decision to start getting healthier?
So there was a mild change of direction. From about the time I was 18 to 20, I put myself in the ER 6 times, DKA 2 of the 6. So that was pretty much, I just even went as far to be so stupid as to just not take insulin. I really don't understand what the thought process was, but at that time, I don't want to be a diabetic anymore. And so that was probably...
Was it burnout, do you think?
Looking back and having terminology to apply to it, it 100% was.
Sure.
It was... I was very emotionally down. I was very... this was also the time that I got physically really ill, usually from, the blood sugars being all over the place and being so high for so long. And I was a very small person at that time. I was around 117 pounds. Right. So I was very frail, kind of mentally, emotionally, and physically. And so it just didn't work well with that over ego that develops in kind of your late teenage years. And so I met who is now my wife, and this advances into my early 20s. Met who is now my wife. We moved out here, and I started more of a career instead of just a job to get by. And access to money became more readily available, and as did health insurance. And so I started doing the things that I thought I needed to do to take care of myself. And really that just meant dosing insulin like it was going out of style. I was taking an obscene amount of insulin. And so it made me put on just an enormous amount of fat. I was about 172 pounds and was about 36% body fat. So I was, very not doing myself any favors, because insulin resistance was catastrophically bad. And like I said, I was treating insulin like water, and just taking a sip of it every hour on the hour, almost trying to keep highs down and still eating, tortillas and corn chips and burgers and stuff like that. So then we get along to 2008, I believe. And my wife come to me. We were married at that time. She comes to me and she said, I'm pregnant. Okay, that was unplanned for. And I came to, once again, the internal processes start up again. Now there is going to be a life that is dependent on me to provide. And if I'm not here, I can't provide. If I'm sick, I can't provide. I've got to get my act together. The status quo is no longer good enough. And my A1Cs were not horrible, but once again, I was taking so much insulin, it didn't really relay how poor of health I was really in. So I was in like low 8s, high 7s. And I knew that physical fitness had to be a part of what was going to be better health. Why, I don't really know, but that was the first place that my brain went to. And so I started, and I worked with the guy probably roughly on and off for about a year, and it was just kind of is what it is. But then I started working with a new trainer, and he pushed me to the point that I threw up the first night. And he thought I was done. He was like, we've hit the threshold. We found it. This was harder than I needed to push you. We're done. And I said, no, we're not done. And I walked back in and I finished my set. And he just kind of looked at me like I was an idiot. And partly I was. You're not supposed to push yourself that far. But that stubbornness, that will and desire was there.
That's that little boy that you were describing before.
Yep.
Moving forward and not giving up. Yeah, that's amazing.
Yeah. So my daughter, and I still look at my daughter, and she's fixing to turn 9, and that moment in my life, she was the catalyst that started all of this. I never would have stepped foot in the gym. I never would have put forth that effort if it hadn't been for her.
Yeah, there's nothing more motivating than something that's outside of yourself, that's your own flesh and blood, right? That is going to depend on you 100% for their success in this world. That's so great. So there's different disciplines, and you talked a little bit about going into the gym and your trainer pushing you, and there's different disciplines of lifting. So we have bodybuilding, we have powerlifting. There's different reasons why people lift weights in the first place. So you're a powerlifter and strongman competitor now, but it didn't start out that way. You started out as a bodybuilder, correct?
Yeah. So I did what most guys in their early 20s do. I was a huge Arnold Schwarzenegger fan. So the first thing I did was, he has a book called the Encyclopedia of Bodybuilding.
That's the Bible. Yeah, that's right.
Yep. I picked up the book, and I told the trainer, I said, we're going forward. I want you to just put slabs of muscle on my body. I'm tired of being the runt. I'm tired of being weak. And I will put forth any effort necessary to change that.
So how tall were you at that point? I'm just curious.
About that time, I'd finally hit about the 5'7" mark. Okay. And so probably about the time I was in 22, 23, I topped out at height at 5'7".
Okay.
So we just, we started training together. I lost some of the body fat. I probably got down, still really didn't get super lean. I got down to about 27% body fat. But I was training 5 to 6 days a week, and they were very intense bodybuilding type sessions, sets to failure, sets beyond failure, doing exercises back to back and supersets. And just your pretty typical, what most people would envision as bodybuilding. And it was rough. I mean, it was, leg day would come around, and I would, get a little pit in my stomach and be like, today's the day. Like, you're going to go so hard that you're going to throw up again. And I had no wall. Yeah. I mean, there was no quit. At times he would have to pull me back and be like, dude, you've got to stop. But that's just a personality trait. If I'm going to do something, I'm very decisive in that way, and that I'm going to follow it to its inevitable conclusion, whether that's an exercise or a life choice or whatever it may be.
So especially when you're coming out of that bodybuilding world at the beginning, supplementation is such a huge part of that world. And as someone who is managing type 1 diabetes, you have to be very concerned or aware of, not concerned is probably, well, concern might be an appropriate word also, about what you're putting into your body and how it's going to impact your blood sugars. But ultimately, if you're looking to put slabs of muscle on your body, you have to supplement with something, right?
Yeah, and I was pretty lucky in that the guy that was training me was not real big into the hype products. There's very few things out there that clinically have a lot of backing behind them. So I did creatine monohydrate, obviously. It's one of the most well-researched supplements out there. I did a protein powder. In fact, I did 2 different kinds. I did a whey powder, and I did a casein powder for diet. But he really was like, it's food. Like, you're just going to have to eat.
Sure.
And so,
just as an aside, we're not recommending for anybody who's listening to this in terms of, we're not recommending any specific supplements.
No,
you're just telling us what you were doing at that period of time.
Yeah, this was my own personal journey through it, and to the point today that I use a multivitamin, and that's probably about it. Supplements are at best the very minor thousandth of a percent on top of a solid nutrition plan and a solid training plan.
Excellent. I do want to dive into your nutrition also, but I agree with you 100%. I think that your foundation has to be what you're putting in your body from a foods perspective first. Yeah. So yeah, sorry, go ahead.
No, I just to give you an idea, and once again, this was not the best method to use, but it was a method that I employed because it was what I was seeing in the bodybuilding world. And so for me to break a 200-pound body weight, I got to about 193, and I couldn't seem to move past that plateau. And so for me to break that, I literally spent almost a year eating nothing but chicken and brown rice. And I ate that 6 to 7 times a day. And it was 7 ounces of chicken, of cooked chicken, not raw. So probably about 50 to 60 grams of protein per meal. And it was 50 grams of carbs per meal via brown rice. And I ate that 6 to 7 times a day.
How was that impacting your blood sugars, though? Were you finding yourself becoming insulin resistant as a result of all the animal product, or no?
No, not really. If I'd have done, and we'll get into that because I do have a very interesting kind of quandary that I've come across in the last couple of years. But what I found is that once again, this is what I did, and I don't recommend it, is that I was feeding the basal more than I was bolusing a lot. So it was and you can only do that if you are literally going to repeat the same day over and over and over and over again. Because there's no way to, especially with things like Lantus, there's no way to forecast different carb amounts. But I still found, because I was so active, we're training 5 to 6 days a week. We're doing a little bit of cardio even on the off day. So 7 days a week, there was some sort of physical activity happening. And the meals were, that was the threshold. 50 grams of carbs was the threshold. If I ate more than 50, I got really bad spikes. If I ate less than 50, it just wasn't enough to get the caloric amount that I needed in. So that was the threshold. And I could modulate that, and my A1Cs were still 6.4 to about 6.7 during that time period. And once again, this is the thing, we go back to everybody's so different. I have had A1Cs in the high fives. My performance has always suffered. And so as for me personally, and I really can't state that enough, for me personally, my ideal A1Cs are 6 to 6.3. And that seems to be where my body is happiest, and that seems to be where I can fuel myself for the sport sufficiently to still make progress.
Sure. That's good enough.
Yeah.
Yep. So you, at some point you transition from the bodybuilding world into the powerlifting side of things, which is a very different way to lift weights. Yeah, you're not looking at necessarily all of the things that a bodybuilder might look at, like symmetry or being very lean and cut. You're just looking at pure strength at this point, and to move as much mass as you possibly can move. So clearly your training changes just a little bit for that. But what served as kind of the transition from the bodybuilding into the powerlifting side of things?
Realizing that I was genetically always going to have chicken legs.
Welcome to the club. Yeah.
Yeah. Do you remember the old 80s cartoons, and each character was a different shape, and Mr. Strong was the upside down triangle?
Yes.
I am Mr. Strong.
Excellent.
I look like an upside down triangle. I have very broad shoulders. To give you an idea, my suit jacket is a 56 short.
Wow.
So very broad. And and then my legs are not anywhere near enough to balance out, because and for those that don't know, in bodybuilding they want you to have what's called an X frame, and so you need to look like an hourglass. You need to have broad shoulders, narrow hips, and then big thighs to give the illusion of the triangle at the bottom. And I was never going to have big thighs.
See, the problem is that you gave up on your trainer on those leg days. You didn't push yourself enough.
I didn't push myself hard enough.
That's right. So at some point you transition from powerlifting, you get involved in strongman competitions, which I want to understand that transition too, because that's really interesting to me. I'm just a touch older than you, and I remember strongman competitions that were on like Saturday morning TV, and I remember vividly, and you're probably going to know this because he was a bodybuilder along with being best friends with Arnold Schwarzenegger, Franco Columbu. Yep. Who I remember vividly watching this guy run with a refrigerator on his back in the strongman competition and completely dislocating his leg and the thing turning in the opposite direction. And that literally has sat with me for my entire life when I think of strongman competitions. It's probably a little different now than it used to be.
Yeah.
The concepts are the same, though. It's you're carrying really heavy stuff from one point to the other, or lifting it over your head. Maybe you could describe a little bit to me and to everybody who's listening, one, how you got involved in strongman and kind of what it's all about, how the competition works. If we can get into that, that would be great.
So we spent about 4 years as a power lifter, and I actually tore my groin twice and got really out of shape, cardiovascularly speaking. And so I decided that I need to do something different, something that's still challenging, that's still a strength sport. I don't have great shoulder range of motion, and so weightlifting was never an option. And just so happened that in Houston, Texas, a World's Strongest Man finalist decided to put on a 2-day seminar. And a buddy of mine sent it to me, and I said, I've got to go to this. I have to go. So like at a week out, I'm calling the guy being like, hey, do you have any spots open? And he was like, yes, calm down. There's plenty of spots. And so I hopped on a plane, flew across the state to go to this seminar. And we went through every movement you could imagine. We drug anchor chains, we flipped tires, we pressed logs, we loaded stones, we carried kegs, just the whole gambit. And I fell in love. What I'd loved about powerlifting was the strength aspect of it, but I'd always found it lacking in that it was so mundane. You stand in one spot and you squat. You lay on a bench and you bench. You stand in one spot and you pick a barbell up, and that's a deadlift. I always thought that I wanted more. Like, what else can I do? There should be another way to exhibit strength. And bear in mind, I was a ranch kid, and so we hauled hay every summer. So I was very used to moving with loads and tossing loads overhead. And so strongman, I was like, I'm made for this. This is it. This is what I've been missing. And so I rehabbed the groin tear and found a trainer to remote coach me through. Ended up doing my first contest in 2013. And they have in what everybody sees on TV is the World's Strongest Man. And those guys are 6 foot plus, 300 to 400 pounds plus. They're the absolute biggest and strongest people in the world. In the amateur setting, there's weight classes. And the weight classes start as low as 150 pounds, and they go up to the super heavies, which is an unlimited weight. So I compete in the under 200 pound division. And so technically my weigh in, I have to weigh no more than 200.4 pounds. And so that's the division that I've always competed in. I competed it as a 220 in powerlifting or a 198, depending on whether I wanted to drop a little bit of water weight. So I just, after the first contest, we deadlifted a car at the first contest. How can you not love a sport that teaches you how to pick up cars?
Yeah, just to give everybody an understanding of this, he's not joking. He's literally lifting a car. And what we're going to do, Rodney, if it's cool with you, we're going to grab some pictures, and I'm going to put this up on the show page as well, because I think it's really important. You could talk about lifting a car, and you're pulling trucks. You're doing some nutty stuff when it comes to strength. But until you visualize it, I remember seeing a picture of you when I was doing research for the show. It looks like a truck axle with 4 tires on it. It looks like you're shrugging. It's insane. I don't even know how you prepare for this stuff.
well, you either make your own equipment or you find a fabricator. There's only about 1 or 2 guys in the entire state of Texas that fabricate this type of equipment. That was actually a deadlift. I know what picture you're talking about. So that was a really, really cool experience. I was invited to go to Phoenix, Arizona to do this contest. And it was a World's Strongest Man finalist by the name of Jerry Pritchett. And another World's Strongest Man finalist was the judge. And the rep counter that was counting my reps was multiple World's Strongest Woman, Jill Mills. So it was a very just surreal experience. And since you listened to it back in the day, Bill Kazmaier was the MC for the event.
That's like royalty right there.
Exactly. So I was invited to come out to do this, and I was like, I have to do this. I have to go out there and do it. And so it was 455 pounds was and it was an axle bar. And so it's a 2-inch diameter bar that doesn't rotate. And so it literally is as dead weight as it can possibly get.
And it's not easy to get your hands around a 2-inch diameter bar either. Yeah.
No. And you'll see, when you look at the pictures of me, you'll realize that I am not a large man. I'm 5'7". I don't have overly large hands. I'm not some sort of freakishly proportioned individual. So a lot of it is just you have to have really good technique, and you have to be just really strong to do some of these things.
But I think there's another component to it also that I'd like to ask you about is the mental game, right? Because you have to. I've never been in the position where I'm lifting an axle, right? But I have to imagine that you're standing there over this. You've got so much going on in your head. You have to be psyching yourself up for this. What's the mental game like when you're trying to prepare, when you're preparing to lift something like that?
So I consider myself to be a phenomenally blessed person in that I have the ability to flip the switch on demand. So, and what I mean by flip the switch, I can basically shut out everything when I need to. And focus solely on the task. I've gotten in trouble before because I've literally shut out the surroundings well enough that I miss the judge calling the rep. So I'll hold things for too long because I don't hear the judge give me the down command. But at the same time, I'm able to literally devote all of my person into the task at hand. And it was somewhat learned. Because once again, I'm definitely not what one would consider really a naturally strong. I wasn't the star football player or the basketball player, so I didn't have all this natural athletic aptitude. So I literally have to outwork and just go to another level to get the same things done.
Gotcha. Some people might call that flow state to a certain extent, right? Because you're in this zone essentially, where you're at peak performance with. You're just depending on all of the technique and the strength that you've developed, and you're just kind of letting your body do what it has to do. So, so I want to talk a little bit about, because we've gone through your entire life so far, and I really appreciate this, and it really is. It's so important for me because it helps to tell the story of you, but it also, there's so many other people out there that might have similar types of experiences. Putting the strongman stuff aside.
Yeah.
If you could go back at some point in your past and have a conversation with a younger Rodney, is there something that you would want your younger self to know that you know now?
Man, there's 2 really big things. The first one being it's not that you are searching for sympathy or pity when you talk about being a type 1 diabetic. It's that you are sharing the fact that you are capable of doing something that most people with healthy pancreases aren't doing. And that took me a long time to get over, and that's why I'm so late coming into the advocacy game, is because for the longest time, it was always the mindset of, this is my disease and no one cares and it's mine to deal with. And I couldn't be more wrong in the fact that I can have a positive influence on people for no other reason than just by showcasing what I can do with type 1. And it's not an egotistical thing. And so that was a battle, and I still catch myself fighting that battle. 2, as an athlete, I wished I'd spent much more time and focus on the flexibility and the mobility aspect when I first got into training. I've accrued a considerable number of injuries at this point because, once again, with that focus comes, and stubbornness comes the point of pushing too far. So it does have inherent risks, and I wish that I had set myself up to be healthier and more mobile, joint and muscular tissue wise. And I would probably be a better athlete today because of it.
There's actually a great book. I love both of the things that you said, and just kind of piggybacking on that mobility component of it. I'm not sure if you're familiar with a PT. His name is Kelly Starrett out on the West Coast. Yeah, that's such a great book when it comes to, and I'm not endorsing anything here, clearly. I'm not a physical therapist. I'm just saying from personal experience what I've read. It's just such an amazing book, and he's got such a wealth of knowledge when it comes to the mobility part of things for anybody, not just athletes.
Yeah. If you are an athlete, and the one addendum I'll add to that, because I am very familiar with Kelly, and I agree it's a phenomenal book to own, is that there is literally a $5 app that you can download that is a trigger point, and wave that aside for a moment. What it does is it actually will show you the usual spillover pain areas when a muscle is overly tight or triggered, but it also gives you the origin, the insertion, and the action of most muscles on the body. And so if you are a strength athlete or you enjoy physical activity or working out, things like that are huge boons in your arsenal of better understanding, because it's all movement. And if you understand what's supposed to be moving, then you're much more able to recognize when things aren't moving properly, and that can help you to stave off injury.
Sure. I'll get that offline from you. Maybe we'll put that in the show notes, also a link to it, so everyone can check it out and see if it's valuable for where they're at with their training. You know, you said something in point 1 that you were kind of late to the game when it comes to advocacy, but you actually launched something called Bolus and Barbells, which combines not only your love of powerlifting and strongman, but also you're really helping to inspire other type 1s. But equally as important, and something that I talk a lot about on this show, is taking somebody from thought process to action. You're actually putting people in the gym. Yep. Maybe you could describe a little bit about kind of the genesis of Bolus and Barbells and kind of what you're doing with the project.
Okay, yeah. Bolus and Barbells has only been around for 2 years. This is our first year as an official nonprofit. It started last year. It probably started about 2 years ago. I was talking to a buddy of mine, and we're both powerlifters. And I said, it'd be really nice if there was some sort of group or resource that catered more towards us that enjoy resistance training, because it doesn't exist as far as I have ever found. And so if you're out there and you hear this, please come find me, because I would love to talk to you. But I'd never found a resource, some sort of either meetup or online group or something like that. Now, I was an admin of the Type 1 Diabetic Athletes Board for several years, and stepped away when Bolus and Barbells became, when it really took off. But that was all sports. And so runners, swimmers, cyclists, all that. And they would mention all these meetups and groups for runners or swimmers or cyclists, or even guys and women that do the Ironman. but there was nothing for resistance training. And I was like, this needs to change. Like the things that are happening in the body during anaerobic exercise is much different than what's happening during aerobic exercise. And we need to at least talk about it and see if we can't get to a better understanding of it amongst all of our mutual experiences. And so we just kind of kicked it around, and there's another company out there called Donuts and Deadlifts. And I was like, oh, that's catchy. Like, I like the name, I need to come up with something like that.
Yeah, the donuts part doesn't work for diabetes, though.
True. I need to do something about that. So let's do bolus and barbells. And I shared it with a friend of mine, Danielle Hargenrader, who's a great advocate herself, and she's written a book, The Diabetes Dominator. She was like, you have to do something with this. Like, let me help you do something with this. And so she wrote all these articles and interviewed me, and we got all this content out there, and I scheduled an event for June 11th in Austin, Texas. And we were mainly just pulling from the articles, which I really didn't have any way to gather feedback from those outside sources. So I didn't know if anybody was even reading these things. And then I knew in the athletes group, we were around like 4,000 members at the time. And so, we had the people that were interested were really interested. And so we had people fly from all over the place. We had people fly from LA, from New York, New Jersey to come down for this event. And there ended up being about 28 of us, type 1 diabetics, a couple of spouses, all in the same room. And I'm standing up there, and I had very, very little idea of even what to talk about. I had a couple of other people that were kind of big members in the athletes group that were going to speak. And it just came to me, and I looked out and I said, you are in a room of people that understand you on a level that not even your family or spouse can. We understand very intimately what it is like to have a high blood sugar, to have a low blood sugar, the feelings of loss of control that happen when you wake up in the middle of the night with a severe low. The people beside you understand you on a very base level. And that's the truth of it. The other truth of it is that we are actively pursuing things to improve our lives. I'm a huge proponent of physical fitness being a cornerstone tool to help manage type 1 and lots of other diseases, but we won't go into that. So we are all actively working our way down the same path. We may be at different spots in that journey. And so you may be a brand new person that's never lifted a weight before in your life, but you have the intrinsic motivation to know that you need to take a step down a path. So let me shine some light on the path for you, and you can decide from there if you want to continue down it or not. And so that it took off. And the feedback that I got, it literally left me in tears, because I'd never even imagined that it could have had such a profound impact on someone's life. And I said, well, I have to do another one. And the people that I met at that one helped me then put on the next one. And we went to Philadelphia and we put one on there, and we had 48 people show up. And we had, and like you said, we have speakers during the first part of the day. Gary Schneider came and spoke at the Philly event, a very well-known CDE. And then we break into groups and we lift, and, we share that. I teach Strongman just because of who I am and how much I love the sport and how empowering Strongman is for people, because I can take anybody and I can have them pull a truck or press a log overhead. These things are very scalable, but those are things that you never would have imagined that you could do. And so once you realize that you are powerful in and of itself and that you can do these things, it's a very rewarding experience to see that realization take place.
That's so amazing. The other thing that I've learned about you is that you've also taken your advocacy and your strongman abilities to camps as well. How is that different for you? Because you're talking about bolus and barbells, which is primarily adults with type 1 and spouses, and now you're talking to younger the younger generation of type 1s that are now at the very beginning of this journey in many cases, and they're in some cases they're probably scared. There's uncertainty. Their parents are really kind of scared and uncertain as well, and you're coming in here and you're showing them what's really possible. So how is that different for you talking to that group?
So I have a very overreaching point that I make at every one of these events, and that having type 1 diabetes is like having a superpower. Now, everybody goes, no, no, where did this guy come from? Like, why is he here? He has no idea what he's talking about. He just told us that having an autoimmune disease is like having a superpower. The point is that you are already doing something far more difficult than most tasks that will ever cross your path in life. You are managing a disease that requires constant monitoring, constant adjustment, and constant feedback from your medical team. You are already winning. The fact that those kids are at camp means they have won. They have empowered themselves. Their parents have empowered them to surround themselves with people that understand them first and foremost. They can develop friendships with people that they can then turn to when they do reach stages of diabetes burnout. Hey, I can't do this anymore. Like I'm at my wit's end. I understand. That's what their friend can say, because they truly can, because they know firsthand what it's like. And so they've won. They show up to a game. I ask them all, and most of the time they play sports of some kind, or they're in band or whatever. I said, you're stepping out on a competitive platform with people that don't have type 1. You've won. I don't care if you never score a goal. Whatever you do, you've already won, because you have shown up against a disadvantage and proven that you are just as capable to be there as any non-diabetic. You've won.
Awesome message, man. That's beautiful. So what's coming up next for you?
We're looking at a bolus and barbells in Northern California. We're still locking down a definitive location. I personally am looking at a contest for myself in the end of October, the Strongman contest. I've been really fortunate to meet a lot of really great people in the sport of Strongman. And so, anytime I go to a contest, it's like coming to meet old friends. And so I'll compete as long as I'm able to stand on two legs, probably. Just for that very reason. But, we're just, like I said, we're a brand new nonprofit. And so I'm learning as I go. We reach stages where we realize we're deficient in some areas and we need to kind of backtrack and fill the gaps. And so ever onward. And then I would love the speaking things for me are important, because it's so these kids, they need somebody to tell them that they're different, but they're not different, that they can still do anything they can do. And I think Strongman is a wonderful way to do that, because the lifts are so visually large. I rolled a frying pan for the kids at the Texas Lions camp, and they just thought that was the coolest thing ever.
And when you say roll it, you bent it in half.
Yes.
That's not easy to do.
No. It does take a bit of effort. But you can show them that, lifting cars and rolling frying pans is not everybody's cup of tea. Obviously, I get that. But if I can do these things, then there's no reason why you can't play baseball or you can't play basketball. You can't excel at these sports.
Anything's possible.
Exactly. And that's the goal, is just to spread that message as wide and as far as I absolutely can within my power.
Awesome. So where can everybody find you online? What are the best places to connect with you and also to find Bolus and Barbells?
Bolus and Barbells has a website, which is www.bolusandbarbells.org. We're on Facebook, Bolus and Barbells. I'm on Facebook, Rodney Miller. My bearded face is my profile picture, so should be pretty easy to find. Instagram, I post a lot of stuff to Instagram, and it is at Strong Like Troll.
Yeah, where did that come from? That's what I wanted to ask you that question.
So actually, that is my nickname from work. Is Strong Like Troll. I was going to walk out of a doorway in front of two of the heads of the company, and they realized that I was as wide as the doorway. And they said he's just like a giant cave troll lumbering around.
That's so funny.
It just stuck.
That's awesome. So I'm going to put all that information in the show notes so everybody can connect with you and connect with Bolus and Barbells as well. So I have just two final questions for you. Okay. So first one, what's the best piece of advice anyone has ever given you?
Oh, there's literally so much. The best piece of advice probably was given to me by Daniel Hargenrader, a really good friend of mine, who kind of pushed me in the direction of advocacy, in that I could have some sort of value. And, I was talking to her, and like I said, I was really having a difficulty coming to terms with, I don't want to look like I'm asking for sympathy or pity when I say that I'm a type 1 diabetic who's doing these things. And she said, Rodney, it really has nothing to do with you. You are merely a vessel for the message. And so I've treated everything going forward with that kind of mindset, realized that you can affect change, and that it's not, speaking up is not something to be looked down upon. Your journey is your journey, but it may also be the journey that somebody else is going down. And so your message may get them through that rough patch that you've already traversed. So
great advice. So final question for you, Rodney. What is your definition of the word brave?
See, and I feel like most people don't think fear should be ever in their mind. And I'm just the opposite. I think if you're not if you don't have things you're afraid of, you're not pushing yourself. So bravery to me is not the absence of fear, but the ability to move past fear. I completely am terrified. Believe it or not, I'm terrified to speak to children. Adults, I can talk to them all day, every day. I'm terrified to speak to children. But at the same time, I have something that I think can be valuable to them just through my life experience. So when I get on stage, I still get the butterflies, and I just move past it. The bravery comes from doing the things despite the fear.
Awesome. Rodney, I can't tell you how psyched I am that we had a chance to connect, and really thank you so much for spending some time with me here today. It's really hard not to be inspired and motivated by a guy who can lift a car. So thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a great experience.
That's awesome. Thank you. So if you guys are interested in learning more about Strongman Rodney Miller and the Bolus and Barbells events, or connecting with him, please head over to thebravestlife.com/009 and check out all the details on today's show and links to things we discussed in the show notes. You'll also find Rodney's social media details there if you want to connect with him that way, and I know he'd love to hear from you guys, especially if you're in the powerlifting game and also the strongman game. So as always, I want to thank all of you for joining us for this episode of The Bravest Podcast. If you like what we're doing here, please be sure to share this episode with someone you love. Again, the link for the episode is thebravestlife.com/009. And we're also up on iTunes, and it would really mean so much if you would just take a few minutes of your day to head over to iTunes and please leave an awesome review on what we've done so far. That's really a great place to share some good vibes with anyone impacted by diabetes or anyone just trying to take life head on to create the healthiest version of themselves. Awesome interview. Thanks, Rodney. Thanks again, everyone. I'm Craig, and we will catch you next time on The Bravest Podcast.